Radiation monitors in Sweden and Finland this morning are showing unusually high readings, in places 3 times normal levels.
It is an accident with enormous ramifications.
Moscow television claimed the Western media are spreading rumors.
We will show a photograph taken by one of the workers at the Chernobyl nuclear plant, taken just after. So there is no gigantic damage, and there is no great fires, and there aren't thousands of people dead.
Well, of course, it's a hideous and horrible disaster, the result of something we're very familiar with from the nuclear industry all over the world, which is a great deal of corner cutting, bad design, bad practice of all kinds, which applied particularly in the Soviet Union, but also applies to nuclear companies elsewhere in the world.
Most of which were peer-reviewed in the Russian literature, in peer-reviewed journals, estimating the number of deaths, illnesses, congenital deformities, cataracts, cardiovascular disease, looking specifically to the liquidators. Now, this was the first time any Slavic papers were translated into English.
Just say one more thing about the claims that she's making. I mean, she ends, she says 2 things. First of all, that there's all these deformities caused. So far, there is no evidence whatsoever that these deformities are the result of Chernobyl, and the danger is that we are exploiting extremely vulnerable people here, people with deformities and genetic diseases, and using them, parading them like a kind of medieval circus, and using them to try to support a political point. And I think that is grossly irresponsible and a pretty horrible thing to do.
Okay, I'd like to...
Of the 850,000 liquidators, about 25% have died. In fact, one of the liquidators was at the conference discussing what has happened to his friends, most of whom have died. Many of the liquidators have had children, many of which have gross congenital deformities. In fact, there are pediatric hospitals now full of the most grossly deformed children that we have ever seen in pediatric literature. And there's a film called Chernobyl Heart, which you should watch, that shows these children. We don't expect to see genetic abnormalities yet. In fact, it may take 20 generations for genetic abnormalities to express themselves. So it takes a long time in human beings to see genetic diseases. And this is from peer-reviewed literature, not quite as carefully peer-reviewed as the Western literature. And the truth is WHO, UNSCAR and IAEA have virtually not looked at what's been happening at Chernobyl. I would say this is the biggest medical cover-up in the history of medicine.
I agree with you. I mean, I'm not an expert in radiation biology at all, but I do have an understanding of the role of the international communities, and especially the International Atomic Energy Agency and UNSCAR, and those official publications. I've no reason to believe that in any way, shape or form that they represent a cover-up. And
further afield, most of the public living around the area of Fukushima were evacuated beyond the 20-kilometre zone, and many of those beyond the 30-kilometre zone, which the exclusion zone that was imposed. But there were some people who were slow-moving, who stayed within the area in the first few days, and some of those were encouraged to take iodine pills to prevent probably the greatest risk from the nuclear, the radiation leaks, which is iodine, radioactive iodine, which can get into the thyroid gland and cause cancer.
We cannot build nuclear reactors anymore because, in fact, even if there aren't meltdowns at Chernobyl or, the 4 at Fukushima, we've got the radioactive waste which lasts for up to 500,000 years. There's no way to store it safely. It will leak inevitably and concentrate into food. You can't taste, smell or see the radioactive elements. And I must say, Laurence, that background radiation, yes, it's responsible, as physicians know, for about 30% of the cancers we already see. It has caused evolution by mutation of genes, so fish develop lungs, birds develop wings, humans evolved. We all carry several hundred genes for disease, like cystic fibrosis, diabetes and the like. And as you increase the background radiation, these diseases, by mutation in the genes of the eggs and sperm will increase in frequency throughout the time history. And radiation, internal radiation, like plutonium getting into your lung, irradiates a tiny volume of cells with a very high dose. The ICRP and the IAEA and the WHO talk about external radiation, but there are differences. Internal emitters cause very much damage to cells and cause cancer in very minute amounts. You can't take external radiation, which does cause cancer, as we know, and compare it to internal emitters and
Subject to internal radiation, from the food that we eat. I mean, I think every one of us, just from the potassium in our bodies, is being subjected to 15 million radioactive disintegrations per hour.
Okay, I'd just like to bring the discussion back to Fukushima. George, you are on record with quite a controversial comment piece that said that the Fukushima crisis actually allayed some of your fears about nuclear power. Could you explain that?
Yes, I mean, of course, it's just like Chernobyl. It's a truly horrible crisis and a very traumatic one. And it also reflects some very poor design and poor management on the part of the plant operators.
If I can just ask Professor Williams, governments around the world have now paused their nuclear programs, including the UK, a brief pause, in response to Fukushima. Is that an overreaction?
Managing that hazard potential such that the risk to both the workers and the general public are low. And I believe that modern reactor designs, modern nuclear facilities, countries which operate strong and rigorous independent regulation ensure that the risks to the people and the public and society are acceptably low.
Well, of course, the big question for the UK now is whether we should push ahead with a new generation of nuclear power stations. I mean, George's argument, Helen Caldicott, is that this is the least worst option in a sense. Unpalatable though it is, the deaths associated with coal pollution and coal mining mean that it's just not as bad. What do you say to that argument?
Well, first of all, nuclear power plants don't stand alone. The uranium has to be mined, and it's usually mined in areas of indigenous communities. And if you look at those communities and the studies done epidemiologically, many of those communities suffer very high rates of cancer already from mining uranium, which is dangerous, and I go into that in my book, Nuclear Power is Not the Answer. So all the way through the nuclear fuel cycle, people, workers and civilians are exposed to radiation. And Laurence, I would say that radiation is cumulative. Every dose you receive adds to your risk of getting cancer or your genes being mutated in your eggs and sperm. So therefore, under no circumstance... Can I
was going to say, Professor Williams, I'll come to you in a second. Just carry on.
In every medical textbook it states that under no circumstances should anyone be exposed to any unnecessary radiation because it is cumulative. Each dose you receive adds to your risk of getting cancer. Now, we don't want to jump from the global warming frying pan into the nuclear fire. This is medically contraindicated. I agree with George. We must stop burning coal. Absolutely. James Randerson talks about this. We must stop fissioning uranium because it's a cancer-inducing industry and it increases weapons proliferation around the world over time. But I commissioned a study about 2 or 3 years ago called Carbon-Free, Nuclear-Free, and I held a conference on nuclear power and global warming, and it was suggested that, there's enough renewable energy now available that we can, by 2040, America could be both carbon-free, nuclear-free. The person who did the study, he's a plasma physicist, a quantum physicist, was very skeptical. It's a very important study. You can download it at IEER.org. It's by Arjun Makajani. And in truth, all the renewables that we require now are here. They're cheap. It's a heterogeneous collection of solar, wind, increasing the grid, geothermal, tidal, you name it. But we have to upgrade the grid, and there's enough wind west of the Mississippi to supply the whole of America with 3 times the electricity it currently uses. Unfortunately, the politicians are in the pockets, and this is true, of the coal, the oil, and the nuclear companies. We know this, particularly in America, and the people must demand that renewable energy be used to replace both coal, oil, and nuclear.